A ruined gown can make a room laugh, but it cannot make a noble heart bow. Clara Whitmore learned this beneath the chandeliers of Hawthorne Hall, where 300 candles burned above the grand ballroom, and every polished mirror seemed eager to witness her humiliation. She stood just inside the arched doorway with snow still melting on the hem of her cloak, her cheeks bright from the winter air, her chestnut curls pinned as neatly as trembling fingers had allowed, and her blue eyes shining with that stubborn, lively spark her sisters had always failed to extinguish. She was beautiful in the way morning light was beautiful after a storm, fresh, warm, impossible to command, yet tonight they had dressed her like a joke. The silver gown, her mother's old gown, hung from her shoulders in wounded elegance. One sleeve had been loosened until the lace sagged unevenly. A black stain bloomed near the skirt like spilled ink on moonlight. The delicate hem, which Clara had spent 2 nights mending by candlelight, had been cut in small, cruel places so that each step whispered of ruin. For one breath, no one spoke. Then the ballroom noticed. A lady in pearls lifted her fan too slowly. A gentleman near the punch table smirked into his glass. Somewhere behind Clara, a young woman gave a soft laugh and quickly swallowed it, which only made the silence sharper. Clara's gloved hand tightened around the edge of her cloak. She could feel the heat rising in her face, but she did not lower her head. She had promised herself in the carriage that she would not cry. Not for Beatrice. Not for Evelyn. Not for any guest who believed silk could measure the worth of a soul. Across the room, her sisters stood beneath a garland of winter roses, perfect as painted dolls. Beatrice wore emerald satin, the color chosen because she had heard the Duke favored green. Evelyn shimmered in pale gold, every ribbon placed with military care. They looked at Clara with wide, false concern, and Beatrice pressed a hand to her heart, as if tragedy had walked in wearing torn lace. "Poor Clara," she said, not loudly, but loudly enough. She always did ruin beautiful things. The words moved through the ballroom faster than music. Clara felt them strike, one after another, but her mouth curved into the faintest smile, the kind her mother had once called a lady's shield. She stepped forward. The damaged hem brushed the marble floor. The ink stain caught the candlelight. The room watched, expecting her to flee. Instead, Clara removed her cloak and handed it to a footman whose face softened with pity. Pity was almost worse than laughter. She thanked him anyway, her voice clear, almost cheerful, because Clara Whitmore had never allowed cruelty to steal her manners. At the far end of the ballroom, above the first sweep of the staircase, Duke Alexander Hawthorne stood in black evening dress, still as a figure carved from midnight. He had not smiled once since the guests arrived. He had refused every eager introduction with a cold politeness that left ambitious mothers shivering behind their jewels. Yet now his gray eyes fixed on Clara, not on the ruined gown alone, but on the small red marks near her fingertips where a needle had pricked her skin again and again. He saw the uneven stitches. He saw the lifted chin. He saw the laughter gathering around her like frost. And something behind his controlled expression changed. The orchestra prepared for the first waltz. Every unmarried woman in the room seemed to hold her breath, waiting for the Duke to descend and choose the lady who would be honored before all others. Beatrice straightened. Evelyn adjusted her gloves. Clara remained near the edge of the floor, bright-eyed, wounded, and refusing to disappear. Then Duke Hawthorne moved. The Duke's first step down the staircase was so quiet that several guests did not notice it until the second. By the third, the ballroom had begun to change. Fans lowered. Smiles faded. The orchestra hesitated with bows hovering above strings, waiting for the command that would begin the season's most important dance. Clara felt the shift before she understood it. A pressure in the air, a silence gathering at her back. She had been studying the pattern of the marble floor, not because she was ashamed, but because she needed one calm thing to hold in her mind while the room sharpened. Itself around her, black and white stone, candlelight reflected in thin gold lines. Her own silver hem, torn but clean where she had been able to save it. Then the whispers stopped. Clara lifted her eyes. Duke Alexander Hawthorne was walking toward her. Not toward Beatrice with her emerald satin. Not toward Evelyn with her golden ribbons. Not toward Lady Margaret, whose father owned half the valley and whose mother had positioned her directly beneath the brightest chandelier. Toward Clara. The realization struck the room a moment before it struck her. Beatrice's smile stiffened so completely it seemed painted onto her face. Evelyn's lips parted. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, standing near the winter roses with a glass of lemonade untouched in her hand, went pale beneath her powder. Clara could not move. She could only watch as the Duke crossed 20 feet of polished floor with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never needed permission from anyone. He was tall, severe, and composed, with dark hair brushed back from a face made sterner by sorrow than by age. At 34, Alexander Hawthorne carried his title like armor, beautiful from a distance and impossible to touch. Yet his eyes, when they reached Clara, held no mockery. That was what frightened her most. She knew how to survive mockery. She knew how to survive pity. She did not know what to do with being truly seen. The Duke stopped before her. For one suspended second, the great ballroom of Hawthorne Hall seemed to breathe through a single pair of lungs. Clara became aware of everything at once. The faint scent of beeswax, the snow tapping lightly against the tall windows, the scrape of someone's shoe as they shifted to watch better, the exposed thread at her sleeve brushing her wrist like a reminder of what had been done. Beatrice gave a small, desperate laugh. "Your Grace," she said, stepping forward, "you must forgive my sister. She had some difficulty dressing herself this evening." Clara's cheeks burned, but before she could answer, the Duke turned his head slightly. Not fully, only enough to let Beatrice feel the weight of his attention. "I was not aware," he said, his voice low and even, "that kindness required forgiveness." The sentence fell softly. It landed hard. Beatrice's mouth closed. A murmur passed through the guests, not laughter this time, but surprise edged with caution. Duke Hawthorne looked back at Clara. His gaze moved, briefly and respectfully, from the ink stain to the torn lace, then to her face. He did not pretend not to notice. That would have been another kind of insult. Instead, he acknowledged the ruin without allowing it to define her. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice made Clara's heart stumble. "I hope you will not think me too bold if I ask for the first waltz." The entire ballroom vanished into silence. Clara stared at the gloved hand he offered. It was steady. No pity trembled in it. No amusement hid in the gesture. Only choice. A choice made in front of every person who had expected her to shrink. Her fingers wanted to shake, so she pressed them once against her skirt, gathered the last of her breath, and placed her hand in his. His palm closed around hers with formal gentleness. Warmth passed through the thin glove, startling and real. "Your Grace," Clara said, her voice clear though her heart was racing, "I would be honored." The orchestra began at once, as if rescued from its own fear. The first notes rose beneath the chandeliers, graceful and trembling. Duke Hawthorne led her to the center of the floor. Clara felt the eyes follow them, every one of them, sharp as winter stars. Her torn hem brushed against the marble. The stain showed plainly. The lace hung wrong. And yet, when Alexander placed his hand at the proper distance and guided her into the opening turn, Clara did not feel ruined. She felt lifted from the edge of the room into its very heart. Around them, society adjusted itself with the clumsy obedience of people realizing they had laughed too soon. Beatrice stood frozen among the roses. Evelyn looked as though the music had betrayed her. Clara should have felt triumph. Instead, she felt something quieter, deeper, and far more dangerous. Relief. Not because the Duke had saved her from shame, but because he had looked at her shame and refused to believe it was the truest thing about her. The first turn carried Clara beneath the chandelier, where candlelight scattered across the damaged silver gown and transformed every torn thread into a line of pale fire. She had expected to feel exposed. Instead, beneath Duke Hawthorne's steady guidance, she felt strangely anchored, as though the room had become a storm and his hand was the only fixed point within it. The music moved slowly at first, a graceful waltz that allowed every guest time to stare. Clara knew they were staring. She could feel their judgment pressing against her back, their curiosity brushing her skin more sharply than the winter air had done outside. Yet Alexander did not rush her through the steps or hide her at the edge of the dance floor. He led her through the very center, past the mothers who had measured her worth by fabric, past the gentlemen who had laughed into their glasses, past Beatrice and Evelyn standing silent among the roses. "You dance well, Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was quiet enough that only she could hear it. Clara's breath almost caught. I had good instruction once, Your Grace. Once. Before my mother died. The words slipped out more gently than she intended, and with them came the memory of a small parlor warmed by firelight, her mother humming a waltz while Clara, younger and brighter and not yet careful with her joy, spun across a worn rug in stocking feet. That was before the house grew cold, before bills sat unopened on silver trays, before Beatrice and Evelyn learned that beauty could be used like a weapon and Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore learned to call neglect practicality. Clara looked down for half a second at the silver skirt moving around her ankles. This was hers, she said. The Duke's steps did not falter, but something in his expression softened with restraint. The gown. Clara nodded. She wore it the last winter she was well enough to attend a ball. She told me it had moonlight trapped in the seams. A faint smile touched Clara's mouth, lively despite the ache in her chest. I believed her. I was 9 years old and very willing to believe beautiful nonsense. It does not sound like nonsense. Clara glanced up. The Duke's gray eyes were upon her with a seriousness that made mockery impossible. No, no. Some people leave courage behind in ordinary things. A ribbon, a letter, a gown. He said it as though he knew. As though he, too, owned some object too small to hold so much grief and yet somehow heavy with it. Clara remembered the veiled portrait she had glimpsed above the entrance hall when she arrived, a woman's painted face hidden behind black gauze at the far end of the corridor. The late Duchess, perhaps, the wife society still whispered about. The woman whose absence had turned Hawthorne Hall into a palace of polished silence. Then I am sorry it appears this way tonight, Clara said, forcing brightness into her tone because she disliked sounding wounded. My mother would have scolded me for poor presentation. Would she? With great tenderness. She had a talent for correcting me while making me feel adored. Alexander was silent for several measures. Around them, the ballroom had begun to rearrange itself. The same ladies who had pitted Clara now studied her more carefully. The same men who had smirked now stood straighter, as if the Duke's attention had lent her a rank they were only just learning to recognize. Clara hated that it took a man's choice to make them reconsider her humanity. Yet she could not deny the warmth that rose in her when Alexander turned her past the mirrors and she saw them reflected together. The feared Duke in black, the ruined girl in silver, moving as if the entire room had been built around their silence. Your mother would not be ashamed, he said at last. Clara nearly missed the next step. You cannot know that. I can know what I see. His hand remained formal, careful, never claiming more than the dance allowed. I see a woman who entered a room designed to break her composure and kept it. That is uncommon. Clara swallowed. For one dangerous moment, the lively mask she wore for survival trembled. You are very generous, Your Grace. No, he said. I am rarely that. The honesty startled a soft laugh from her before she could stop it. It was small, bright, and entirely herself. Alexander looked at her as if the sound had opened a window in. A house long sealed against spring. Beatrice saw it from across the room. So did Evelyn. Their faces hardened with the same realization blooming between every candle flame. The ruined gown had failed. Clara had not disappeared. She was being seen, and worse for them, she was beginning to remember how it felt to shine. The waltz ended not with applause, but with a silence so full it seemed to press against the glass of every window. Duke Hawthorne bowed to Clara with the same grave respect he might have offered a duchess, and Clara curtsied in return, her torn hem spreading around her shoes like a silver shadow. For one suspended moment, she thought the worst had passed. She had survived the laughter. She had danced without stumbling. She had carried her mother's gown through the center of the ballroom and had not allowed shame to make her small. Then Beatrice began to clap. The sound was delicate, bright, and poisonous. Others joined uncertainly, relieved to have permission to make noise again. Beatrice crossed the floor with Evelyn close behind her, both smiling the careful smiles of women who had misplaced victory and were searching quickly for another weapon. How charming, Beatrice said, leaning close enough that only Clara, the Duke, and Evelyn could hear. You have always had such a talent for attracting attention in the most unexpected ways. Clara's pulse, which had begun to calm, tightened again. She kept her expression pleasant. Thank you, Beatrice. I believe that is the kindest version of what you wish to say. Evelyn gave a soft laugh. Do not be sensitive, Clara. We are only relieved His Grace was compassionate enough to spare you embarrassment. Duke Hawthorne's gaze moved to Evelyn. It was not anger. Anger would have been warmer. This was colder, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous in a room that obeyed rank as faithfully as prayer. Compassion, he said, is not the word I would choose. Evelyn's smile flickered. Before she could answer, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore arrived, her skirts whispering over the marble, her face arranged into maternal concern. To the room, she looked sorrowful. To Clara, she looked practiced. My dear child, Mrs. Whitmore said, touching Clara's arm with fingers light as frost, you should have told us the gown was beyond repair. We would never have allowed you to come if we had known. The lie was smooth, almost beautiful. Clara felt it slide through the air and settle around her like another stain. She wanted to speak. She wanted, for once, to say that she had locked the gown in her own room, that she had found it ruined only after dinner, that Beatrice had carried the key earlier that afternoon under the pretense of bringing fresh ribbon. But every eye in the ballroom had turned toward them again, and Clara knew the old rule of her household. When she defended herself, they called it bitterness. When she stayed silent, they called it guilt. Her fingers curled at her side. Alexander noticed. Miss Whitmore, he said softly, did you know the gown had been damaged before tonight? Clara looked at him. The question was simple, but the permission inside it nearly undid her. No one in her family asked questions because they wanted truth. They asked only when they had already chosen the answer. I discovered it less than an hour before we left, she replied. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. I had mended it myself. It was whole when I placed it in my room. A whisper moved through the guests. Beatrice's eyes sharpened. Clara, grief has made you imaginative. You were terribly attached to that old thing. It was my mother's. The words came brighter than Clara expected, bright and steady. That is why I was attached to it. The room shifted again. Even those who cared little for Clara understood the cruelty of a ruined keepsake. Mrs. Whitmore's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her fan. Enough, she murmured. You are embarrassing the family. Clara turned to her, and for the first time that evening, something lively and unafraid rose fully in her face. No, ma'am, she said. I believe the family managed that without my assistance. A small gasp escaped someone near the fireplace. Evelyn's cheeks flushed. Beatrice stepped forward, her voice sweetened to hide its edge. How ungrateful you are. After all we have done for you. Clara almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the words were so familiar they had lost their power. Then a young maid appeared at the edge of the ballroom, pale and trembling beside the housekeeper of Hawthorne Hall. In her hands, folded carefully, lay a strip of silver lace and a stained pair of scissors. The housekeeper looked toward the Duke. Your Grace, she said, her voice controlled but grave. This was found in the south cloakroom, hidden behind the Whitmore ladies' traveling cases. The ballroom went still again. Beatrice's smile vanished. Evelyn looked at the lace as if it had spoken her name. Clara stared at the ruined fragment, and the last fragile part of her hope broke cleanly into certainty. Duke Hawthorne did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Bring it here, he said. And as the maid crossed the marble floor, every candle in the room seemed to burn colder. The maid stopped before the Duke with the silver lace trembling in her hands. Though whether from fear or the weight of the room's attention, Clara could not tell. She was a young girl, no more than 16, with fair hair tucked beneath a plain cap and eyes fixed firmly on the floor. The stained scissors rested atop the torn lace like a small, ugly confession. Beatrice recovered first. She always did. How peculiar, she said, her voice airy enough to float above suspicion. Surely many ladies have silver lace this evening. It is hardly uncommon. Evelyn nodded too quickly, and scissors in a cloakroom proved nothing at all. Servants misplace things constantly. The young maid flinched. Clara saw it. So did Alexander. His gaze did not leave the girl's face. What is your name? He asked. Anna, Your Grace. Anna, you have nothing to fear in this house for telling the truth. The words were calm, but Clara heard the promise beneath them, solid as stone. Anna swallowed. Her hands tightened around the lace. I found them after the Whitmore carriage arrived, Your Grace. I was sent to fetch an extra wrap because Miss Clara looked cold. Clara's heart gave a small, startled ache at the simple kindness hidden inside that sentence. She had not realized anyone noticed. Anna continued, each word careful. The south. Cloakroom was empty, but I heard voices in the passage. Two ladies were speaking. One said the stain showed well enough beneath candlelight. The other said Miss Clara would either stay home or make herself ridiculous. The ballroom breathed in sharply. Beatrice's face went pale, then bright with outrage. This is absurd. You cannot possibly accuse us because a servant claims she heard voices. No accusation has been made, Alexander said. Not yet. Mrs. Whitmore stepped forward, her fan snapping closed. Your Grace, this is becoming most improper. My daughters are guests in your home. Surely you will not allow household gossip to insult them publicly. Clara felt the old instinct rise. Smooth it over, apologize, carry the shame quietly so everyone else could remain comfortable. That instinct had been trained into her over years of dinners where her portions were smaller, dresses were older, praise was rarer, and blame always knew her name. But tonight, something had changed. Perhaps it was the Duke's hand, steady during the waltz. Perhaps it was the sight of her mother's lace lying wounded in a stranger's palms. Or perhaps Clara had simply reached the end of silence. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, and the formality of it caused her stepmother to stiffen. When I found the gown ruined, you told me I should be grateful to attend it all. Beatrice said no one would look at me twice. Evelyn said I might finally learn where I belonged. Beatrice hissed softly, Clara. Clara turned to her with a brightness in her eyes that was not joy, not yet, but something near freedom. No, you have said my name all evening as though it were something to pity. I should like to use it myself. A ripple moved through the room, delicate and astonished. Alexander watched her, and for the first time, the faintest trace of admiration warmed the severity of his face. Anna lifted her head a little. There is more, Your Grace. Evelyn's hand flew to Beatrice's arm. Beatrice did not move. When I entered the cloakroom, Anna whispered. One of the traveling cases was still open. Inside was a piece of black ribbon, a small bottle of ink, and a glove with silver thread caught on the button. The housekeeper stepped beside her and unfolded a clean white cloth. Upon it lay the ribbon, the ink bottle, and one pale glove embroidered at the wrist with an emerald letter B. No one needed to explain it. The room understood before the Duke spoke. Beatrice looked at the glove as if it had betrayed her. That could have been placed there by anyone. Indeed, Alexander said. But only one person in this room is missing its match. Every gaze fell to Beatrice's hands. Her left hand wore a glove. Her right was bare, hidden too late behind the folds of her emerald skirt. The silence that followed was merciless, not loud, not dramatic, only complete. Clara looked at her sister and felt no triumph, only sorrow sharpened by clarity. Beatrice had not merely wanted attention. She had wanted Clara erased from the evening, from memory, from possibility. Duke Hawthorne turned toward the assembled guests. This ball was given in honor of dignity, charity, and good society, he said. I find that only one of those qualities has been clearly displayed tonight, and it was not by the ladies most eager to be admired. His words did not name Clara, yet every face turned toward her. She stood in her ruined silver gown, cheeks flushed, curls soft around her face, eyes alive with the fierce brightness her sisters had mistaken for weakness. Then Alexander gave a slight bow in her direction. Miss Whitmore, he said, has shown more grace in humiliation than many show in praise. Clara felt the room change around her, not kindly, not entirely, but honestly. The laughter that had followed her entrance was gone. In its place came something quieter and far more powerful. Respect. Respect did not arrive like applause. It arrived more slowly, in lowered eyes, in softened mouths, in the careful way guests stepped aside when Clara moved from the center of the ballroom. She had not asked for their approval, yet she felt the change with every breath. The same women who had hidden smiles behind painted fans now looked at her as though the damaged silver gown had become a garment of courage. The same gentlemen who had smirked into crystal glasses now bowed when she passed, awkwardly at first. Then with the stiff seriousness of men trying to correct themselves without admitting they had been wrong. Clara wished it did not matter. She wished she were above the small ache of wanting to be treated gently. But she was human, and the human heart, even a brave one, remembers every room where it has been made lonely. Duke Hawthorne dismissed the evidence with a quiet instruction to his housekeeper, who carried the lace. glove, ribbon, and ink away as if removing something spoiled from a table. He did not order Beatrice or Evelyn from the hall. That would have caused a scene too grand for their offense and too generous to their vanity. Instead, he did something far more devastating. He turned away from them completely. In society, to be scolded by a duke was painful. To be ignored by one was ruin in silk gloves. Beatrice stood rigid beside the winter roses, her emerald gown suddenly too bright, her bare hand folded into the fabric at her side. Evelyn whispered something to Mrs. Whitmore, but their stepmother's face had become a mask of calculation and fear. Invitations could vanish after a night like this. Friendships could cool. Prospects could become uncertain. Clara saw all of it, and for a moment her lively spirit, usually quick with warmth or wit, grew still beneath the weight of what had been exposed. Alexander approached her near one of the tall windows where frost had gathered in delicate patterns along the glass. Outside, snow drifted over the dark lawns of Hawthorne Hall, softening the world beyond the candles. Inside, the orchestra had begun another dance, but no one seemed to enter it with the same ease as before. "Are you well, Miss Whitmore?" he asked. The question was simple. Clara found it difficult to answer. "I believe so." Then, because honesty had already cost her less than silence, she added, "I feel as though I have been holding my breath for years and only just remembered how to release it." His expression changed, not openly, but in the small tightening near his eyes. That is a terrible way to live. Clara looked toward the ballroom. Beatrice was pretending to laugh at something Lord Edmundvale said, but he had already angled his body away from her. Evelyn was studying Clara with a look no longer cruel, but frightened. It is a common way to live when a household decides one person must carry every discomfort so the others may remain beautiful. Alexander followed her gaze. "You speak as though this evening was not unusual." Clara's smile returned faintly, bright because it refused to be bitter. The gown was unusual. The intention was not. He was silent. Clara regretted the confession almost as soon as it left her. She had not meant to invite pity. She had spent too long escaping it. "Forgive me," she said lightly. That sounded rather dramatic. It sounded practiced. His words were quiet. "That is worse." Something in her chest tightened. The snow tapped the window in soft, patient strokes. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Around them, candlelight moved over polished wood, satin sleeves, diamonds, silver trays, and faces pretending not to listen. Clara turned her attention to the frosted glass. "My mother loved winter balls," she said. "She said people were kinder in winter because the cold reminded them they needed one another. I think she was overly generous in her assessment." Alexander's mouth almost curved. Perhaps she had not met enough people. Clara laughed softly, and this time the sound was steadier. "She would have liked you, I think, though she might have told you to smile more. Many have attempted that reform, and failed. Completely. Then I shall not attempt it." He looked at her with that same unreadable intensity, the one that made her feel both nervous and strangely safe. "No," he said. "I suspect you would succeed by accident." Clara's cheeks warmed, and she glanced away before the warmth could betray too much. At that moment, a footman approached carrying a folded garment of deep black velvet lined with silver-gray silk. He bowed to the Duke. "Your Grace." Alexander took it and turned back to Clara. "The hall is drafty near the windows." Clara looked at the garment and realized it was not an ordinary wrap. It bore the hawthorn crest embroidered in dark thread near the clasp. "Your Grace, I cannot wear that." "You can," he said. "And you should." His tone held no command, only certainty. Clara hesitated. Then he lifted the velvet cloak and settled it carefully over her shoulders, never touching more than the fabric, never making the gesture anything but honorable. The warmth surrounded her at once, rich and heavy, covering the torn sleeve, the ink stain, the wounded lace, but not hiding her. Somehow it made the ruined gown seem less like shame and more like testimony. Across the ballroom, the guests saw the crest. So did Beatrice. So did Mrs. Whitmore. Clara saw their faces change and understood the meaning before anyone spoke it. The Duke of Hawthorne had not merely offered her warmth. He had offered her protection beneath the eyes of every person who mattered. Alexander stepped back and bowed slightly. "There," he said. "Now the room may look at what it should have seen first." Clara's fingers closed around the velvet edge. Her heart trembled, but her voice did not. "And what is that, Your Grace?" His gray eyes held hers. "You." The word remained between them longer than it should have. "You." Not the gown. Not the stain. Not the family name that had been polished in public and neglected in private. Not the sisters with their practiced smiles, or the stepmother measuring disaster behind her fan. Clara. Only Clara. She looked down at the black velvet cloak resting over her shoulders, its silver gray lining catching the candlelight like winter sky before dawn. It was warm enough to make her realize how cold she had been. Cold from the draft near the windows. Cold from the eyes of the room. Cold from years of being taught to stand near the edge of every happiness as if she were an inconvenience to it. "You are very kind, Your Grace," she said, because manners were safer than feeling. Alexander's gaze did not soften, exactly. It deepened. "No, I am careful." Clara glanced at him. "That is a strange correction. Kindness is often mistaken for impulse. Care is different. Care notices what cruelty hopes will be overlooked." The words entered her quietly, but they did not leave. Before she could answer, Lord Edmundvale approached with an eager bow, his smile too polished and too late. He had laughed earlier near the punch table. Clara remembered the tilt of his glass, the amusement in his eyes, the easy cruelty of a man certain he would never be held accountable for it. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "may I request the next dance? I fear the room has been deprived of your company for too long." Clara studied him for half a breath. The old Clara, the one trained to be grateful for crumbs of attention, might have accepted. The girl who arrived in the ruined silver gown might have believed any offered hand was better than none. But the woman wearing the hawthorn crest around her shoulders understood something at last. Not every invitation was an honor. Some were only apologies wearing perfume. "You are very gracious, Lord Vale," Clara replied, her voice bright and composed. "But I believe the room has had quite enough of my company for one evening." His smile faltered. "Surely you do not mean to withdraw." "I mean to breathe." It was not rude. It was worse for him. It was cheerful, elegant, and final. Alexander looked away toward the windows, but Clara thought she saw the smallest movement at the corner of his mouth. Lord Vale bowed again, less smoothly this time, and retreated into a crowd that no longer knew where to place its gaze. Clara felt something almost like laughter rise inside her, not sharp, not unkind, but astonished. Freedom could be quiet. It could sound like refusing a dance. The orchestra began another waltz, livelier than the last, as if the musicians were trying to rescue the evening from its own conscience. Couples formed carefully. Voices returned in lowered tones. Hawthorne Hall began to breathe again. Yet beneath the music, Clara sensed the story of the night changing shape around her. She was no longer the poor sister to be pitied. She was the woman the Duke had chosen, defended, and cloaked before society. It was a dangerous elevation. Society loved to raise a woman only so it could watch more closely if she fell. "They will speak of this for weeks," Clara said. "Months," Alexander corrected. "You are not comforting." "I have never been praised for comfort." "No, I imagine people praise you for being formidable and impossible, usually in less flattering terms." Clara smiled despite herself. The lively spark returned to her face, brightening the blue of her eyes, warming the delicate color in her cheeks. Alexander watched it happen with a stillness that felt less like distance now and more like wonder carefully restrained. For the first time that evening, Clara wondered what he had looked like before grief taught him to stand so still. She wondered who had made him laugh, who had left that veiled portrait in the corridor, who had taught him that warmth must be rationed like candlelight in a storm. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" she said. "You may. Why did you invite me tonight?" The question changed him. Not dramatically. Alexander Hawthorne did not permit drama to touch his face. But his eyes shifted toward the far corridor, toward the place where the black-veiled portrait waited above the entrance hall. "Because 3 months ago," he said, "on a morning of heavy rain, I stood in the old cemetery behind St. Luke's Church with no umbrella and very little patience for the world. A young woman passed by carrying a basket of bread for the vicar's household. She said nothing about my title because she did not know it. She only handed me a clean handkerchief and told me grief should not be forced to stand in the rain alone." Clara's breath caught. The cemetery, the rain, the stern stranger beside the iron gate. She had thought of him afterward only as a sad man with proud shoulders and wet sleeves. That was you, she whispered. That was you, he answered. The ballroom faded, not away, but back, as if the candles, music, and watching faces had all moved behind a pane of glass. Clara remembered the morning clearly now. She had been late by 10 minutes, her shoes damp, her basket heavy, and yet she had stopped because the man by the graves looked as if the rain had been invited by his sorrow. She had not asked his name. She had not wanted gratitude. She had simply given what little comfort she had and walked on. Alexander's voice lowered. I have met many women who wished to be seen beside me. You were the first in years who saw me and asked nothing in return. Clara looked at him, the ruined gown beneath, his cloak, her mother's memory at her feet, her own heart beating with a frightening new tenderness. I did not know you were a duke. I know. Would it have mattered? To most people, yes. To me, that, he said quietly, is why I sent the invitation. The answer placed a new kind of silence between them, not empty, but full of all the things Clara did not yet know how to name. She had entered Hawthorne Hall prepared to endure laughter. She had not prepared to be remembered. Across the ballroom, the music turned brighter, and couples moved in careful circles beneath the chandeliers, but Clara felt as though she stood inside a smaller room made only of candlelight, falling snow, and the Duke's steady voice. I thought you had forgotten that morning before you reached the church gate, she said. I remembered it before you reached the gate. Clara looked down, smiling despite the heat in her cheeks. The lively part of her, the part her sisters had tried for years to press flat beneath duty and embarrassment, rose with a flicker of old mischief. Then I must apologize. I had no idea I was being memorable. You were inconveniently memorable. That sounds almost like praise. It was meant as confession. The words were calm, but they struck her more deeply than any dramatic declaration could have done. Clara had heard flattery before, usually tossed carelessly across parlors by men who admired a smile and forgot the woman wearing it. This was different. Alexander did not flatter. He observed. He remembered. He carried memory like a sealed letter in his breast pocket, unread by the world, but never discarded. For a moment, she saw past the formidable Duke of Hawthorne to the man in the rain, standing beside a grave with water darkening his coat and grief held so tightly in his jaw that it had seemed carved there. Was it your wife? Clara asked gently. His gaze shifted to the veiled portrait beyond the corridor. Yes. No more. No attempt to soften the word. No invitation for pity. Yet Clara heard the years behind it, the lonely dinners, the empty halls, the rooms preserved too carefully because to change them would feel like betrayal. She did not reach for his hand. She did not offer sentimental comfort. She only stood beside him in silence, the way she had done in the rain, and allowed him the dignity of not being questioned further. After several breaths, Alexander spoke again. Her name was Helena. She loved balls. I disliked them even then. That must have made for interesting evenings. She accused me of frightening the guests with my face. Clara studied his severe expression and failed to hide her smile. She may have had a point. To her surprise, a quiet sound escaped him, not quite laughter, but near enough to make Clara's heart lift. It was brief. It vanished almost immediately. Still, she had heard it. So had he. Alexander looked at her as if she had opened another window in the sealed house of his life. Before either could speak, Beatrice crossed the room toward them with Mrs. Whitmore at her side, both wearing expressions too composed to be honest. Evelyn followed a few steps behind, her gold gown whispering like nervous leaves. Clara, Mrs. Whitmore said, with a strained smile meant for the benefit of nearby guests, we are leaving. You have had an eventful evening, and I am certain you are overwhelmed. Clara felt the old net thrown gently over her. Concern, family duty, public pressure, all the pretty names given to control. I am not overwhelmed, she said. Beatrice's eyes flashed. Do not be childish. You cannot remain here after causing such unpleasantness. The words were a mistake. Everyone close enough heard them. Alexander's face became still. Clara, however, answered before he could. I did not cause the unpleasantness, Beatrice. I wore it. The nearby guests fell silent again. Mrs. Whitmore's smile tightened painfully. You forget yourself. No, Clara said, and the black velvet cloak felt suddenly warmer around her shoulders. For the first time tonight, I believe I remember myself quite clearly. Beatrice leaned closer, lowering her voice. You think his attention changes what you are? Clara met her sister's gaze, and there was no cruelty in her own, only a clear brightness that made Beatrice look smaller than anger ever could. No, his attention changed what everyone else was willing to admit. The word struck cleanly. Evelyn looked away. Mrs. Whitmore inhaled sharply. Alexander watched Clara with something quiet and proud in his eyes. Then he turned to Mrs. Whitmore. Miss Whitmore will leave when she chooses. Until then, she remains a guest under my roof and under my protection. Under my protection. The phrase moved through the surrounding guests like a bell struck once in a cold chapel. Mrs. Whitmore understood. Beatrice understood. Clara understood most of all. It was not a proposal. Not yet. It was something older and weightier in the language of their world. A public boundary no one could cross without answering to him. Mrs. Whitmore curtsied stiffly. As you wish, Your Grace. Beatrice followed, pale with humiliation she had once intended for Clara. When they withdrew, Clara let out the breath she had been holding. You have made tomorrow very difficult, she said softly. For whom? For everyone. Then tomorrow has been improved. Clara laughed, truly laughed this time, bright enough that several heads turned. Alexander looked at her as though the sound had done something the fire in his house had failed to do for years. It warmed the room. The ball did not end in scandal, though every person present would later remember it, as the night's scandal almost learned to blush. It ended with music restored, candles burning lower, and Clara Whitmore standing beside the frosted window in a black velvet cloak marked with the hawthorn crest, while the world that had laughed at her carefully taught itself a new expression. Beatrice and Evelyn remained near their mother, surrounded no longer by admiration, but by the polite emptiness that forms around people society has decided to avoid without appearing unkind. Lord Edmundvale did not return to ask for another dance. Lady Margaret's mother stopped mentioning her daughter's accomplishments quite so loudly. Even the older ladies who usually treated misfortune as entertainment now spoke of Clara in softened voices, as though dignity had surprised them by wearing torn lace. Yet Clara felt no hunger to watch her sisters suffer. The victory she had once imagined, if she had imagined any at all, had been sharper than this. She had thought justice would feel like fire. Instead, it felt like laying down a heavy basket after carrying it for miles. Near midnight, when the final waltz faded and guests began gathering gloves, shawls, and pride from the edges of the room, Mrs. Whitmore approached one last time. Her face was composed, but something brittle lived beneath the powder. Clara, she said, the carriage is ready. Clara looked at the woman who had taught her to apologize for needing warmth, space, fabric, kindness. For years, one word from Mrs. Whitmore had been enough to send Clara back into obedience. Tonight, the word reached her and found no chain left to pull. Thank you, Clara replied. I will not be returning with you. Beatrice's head snapped up. Evelyn stared. Mrs. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. Do not be foolish. Where else would you go? Clara's fingers closed once around the velvet cloak, not for courage now, but in farewell to the girl who had arrived believing she had nowhere else to stand. Before she could answer, Duke Hawthorne stepped beside her. He did not crowd her. He did not speak over her. He simply stood there, a quiet wall against the old storm. Clara turned back to Mrs. Whitmore. Mrs. Hargrove has a sister in town who offered me a room last spring. I refused then because I believed leaving would be ungrateful. Her smile was gentle, almost bright. I have mistaken endurance for gratitude long enough. The words were not loud, but they traveled. Several guests paused in the hall. Mrs. Whitmore flushed. You would shame your family further? Clara's gaze moved to Beatrice's bare hand, to Evelyn's lowered eyes, then back to the woman who had protected appearances more faithfully than people. No, she said. I am finished carrying shame that was never mine. That was the final blow, though it contained no cruelty. Mrs. Whitmore curtsied stiffly to the Duke, gathered her daughters, and walked away beneath the chandeliers. Beatrice did not look back. Evelyn did, once, and in her face Clara saw not apology, but the first uncomfortable shape of understanding. When the doors closed behind them, the ballroom seemed to exhale. Alexander looked at Clara. Mrs. Hargrove's sister will, of course, receive any assistance needed to make you comfortable. Clara's lively eyes warmed with humor. Your Grace, are you attempting to arrange my entire future before the candles burn out? No, That sounded suspiciously like no. I am attempting to ensure you have choices. The humor softened. Choices. The word felt stranger than admiration, stranger than protection, stranger even than hope. Clara turned toward the great hall, where servants moved quietly among fading flowers and cooling wax. Then I choose to return this. She lifted the edge of the velvet cloak. Alexander's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Must you? Not because I do not value it. She unclasped it slowly and folded it over her arms with care. Beneath it, the ruined silver gown appeared again, stained, torn, unmistakable. Clara stood in it without flinching. Because I do not want the room to remember only that you covered the damage. I want them to remember that I stood in it. Alexander looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face eased, not into a smile exactly, but into the beginning of peace. Then they will. He accepted the cloak from her, as if receiving something sacred. At the foot of the staircase, Anna the maid waited shyly with Clara's old wool wrap. Clara took it and thanked her by name. Anna's eyes filled with relief, and Clara squeezed her hand once. A small gesture, but enough. Outside, snow had softened the drive into silver. The night air touched Clara's face, cold and clean. Alexander walked with her to the entrance, stopping beneath the lanterns where the first flakes settled in his dark hair. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "may I call upon you tomorrow?" Clara looked at him, at this solemn man who had remembered a handkerchief, defended a ruined girl, and asked not to possess her future, but to be invited into it. Her heart answered before caution could. "Yes, Your Grace." Then her smile brightened, alive with all the courage her mother had left stitched inside her. "But only if you promise not to look so tragic while doing it." For the second time that night, Duke Alexander Hawthorne almost laughed. This time, he did not hide it quickly enough. Clara carried that sound with her as she stepped into the waiting carriage, not as rescue, not as fantasy, but as the first true note of a life beginning again. Behind her, Hawthorne Hall glowed through the snow like a lantern in a dark field, and the silver gown, though ruined, no longer felt like a wound. It felt like proof. Some gowns are ruined by envy, but some hearts are revealed by the grace with which they endure it.